next Incasi Living Lab, the IAL. I'm really happy to introduce two not only fantastic researchers, but also human beings that I actually had a chance to spend some time with over the last couple of weeks. So we're really happy to have you both here, Juan Carlos and Ezequiel. They will both present today for around 20 minutes. And then the order of the day is that actually afterwards we have a little bit of a panel discussion, okay? So we will hear first from Ezequiel from the University of Buenos Aires. And in the second presentation, we have Juan Carlos Palacios from the University of Barcelona. And then afterwards, we come together in a panel discussion with our Middlesex colleague, Mary Junti, who's a associate professor in ecological governance here at Middlesex. So that's a bit of the running order of the day. As I said, Ezequiel will come first, and then afterwards, Juan Carlos. Followed by that, we have a short Q&A, okay, before we move into the panel discussion. So please note down your questions, and both will take the questions together, okay? So without further ado, I will hand over to Ezequiel, and just need to bring up the slides, and then Ezequiel, the stage is yours. And I'm sorry that I didn't manage to change that to October. It's the 29th of October and not November.
So thank you very much. Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Pam. Thank you all. Thank you, Incasi and all the institutions for this opportunity to share this research concerning inequalities, beliefs, and the current crisis of democracy. I must apologize because I will be going quickly in the first slides because I want to come to the relation between beliefs and inequality. But first of all, a broad presentation of the state of democracies all around the world, and I think that it won't be necessary to introduce this as a period of the crisis of democracies. Here I am using an important book on this topic from Levitsky and Ziblatt, How Democracies Die. And there they introduce 5 typical symptoms of this process of the current crisis of democracies. We can call also this process the process of de-democratization. These 4 symptoms would be the general use of friend and foe rhetoric targeting political and cultural differences, the incitement to violence by political elites and political leaders, attacks on free press and obstruction of legitimate opposition, and disregard for the democratic rule of law. So all of these are symptoms of the current crisis of democracy. I will add that you can observe this crisis from 2 different perspectives, from the perspective of what is happening with the institutions and from the perspective of what is happening in civil society, for instance, the legitimation process of the institutional practice of incitement to violence by political elite. You can have a political leader who use these kind of anti-democratic tools, and you can also have a society that approves that kind of political tools. So here I bring a quick and broad approach to this de-democratization process. Is data from the Varieties of Democracy Institute. It's an institute from Sweden. And I will not get into the details, but what I was trying to show you here, the upward trend is the process of democratization, and the downward trend is the process of de-democratization. Here they are using a liberal democratic index. So I was trying to put in a very simple way is that from after 2008 and before 2014, in every metric, you can confirm this process of de-democratization. Obviously, there are differences between countries, and Argentina starts this process of de-democratization officially for this Varieties of Democracy Lab in 2023. And I will getting into that process of the case of Argentina. But a last theoretical remark, why is this happening? So why is this process of de-democratization happening all around the world? And here are four theoretical approaches to what could be explanatory hypotheses or fields of the academic debate regarding these issues. The first approach is the hypothesis that says the cause of all of this is the objective dynamics of social inequality. And I have the books of Milanovic and of Piketty. The second approach relates this process to a cultural backlash against progress in post-material values, such as ecological, gender, and racial justice. The third approach highlights the accelerated changes in communications. And the fourth approach, which is the one that I will follow, highlight the subjective transformations brought about by neoliberal culture, especially regarding social justice. So I will not come to two empirical approaches that we can use to understand this process of de-democratization in the perspective of the civil society. First, longitudinal analysis from La Pop survey, and then a national survey that I conducted in 2023. So the first will be a diachronical perspective, and the second will be only a one-time analysis. Okay. Here we have, from this survey, the answer to a typical question to search the legitimacy of democracy in different countries. And here I'm presenting the response to this question. Democracy may have problems, but it's the first form of government for Argentina, Brazil, Canada, the US, and Uruguay. As you can see, or as you can notice, there is a sharp decline of approval towards democracy after 2008. In all these countries, they start this period with a global approval of democracy around 90%, and they end this period with a global approval of democracy of around 70%. So there is a clear decline of around 20% of the approval towards democracy. Now, I move to what's behind this trend. So, what are the possible causes of this process here in the specific case of Argentina? And I present the first clue, which is the comparison between the approval or the support to democracy and the approval or the support among citizens towards social justice values. The question here was the Argentine state should implement policies to reduce income inequalities between rich and poor. As you can see, the trajectory of this second topic closely mirrors the dynamics of the fair assessment of democracy. Both trends start at a level of 85, 86%, and they end at 70% of approval. So there is in this period, there is an apparent correlation between support for democracy and support for social justice. Here, I present two photographs of this whole period. I didn't make it more complex, but the cross-tabulation between those variables in 2008 on the left picture, and on the right picture, you can see the same cross-tabulation, but for 2023. As you can see on the left picture, in 2008, there was no correlation between opinions regarding social justice and opinions regarding the support for democracy. Whatever was your position towards social justice, strongly disagree or strongly agree, the support for democracy was quite the same. That was 2008. In 2000, so there was not, clearly there was no correlation between those variables. In 2023, there is a dramatical change in that relation, and now we can see that people that don't support social justice, here the categories 1, 2, and 3, have a quite different approach to democracy than people who support social justice. Here, categories 5, 6, and 7. So in 2023, in this longitudinal analysis, we can start arguing that there is a correlation between those variables. I have made some homework for the conversation about environmental protection and environmental justice. Because in this survey, the LAPOP survey, they have some questions about those subjects. But there are gaps in the data, and I could only bring these specific numbers from 2014, 2017, and 2023. But what I found interesting is that in the same process that you are having this transformation in the support toward democracy, and in the same period that you are having this clear decline in the support towards social justice, the approval for environmental protection was quite stable. It didn't decline as those other variables. I don't have any interpretation of this, but what I can say is that here we can be seeing the support of younger people that may support active public environmental protection, while they are giving, less support to democracy and social justice. So now I will move on to the last data set, and this was a survey that I conducted in September 2023 with the same topics, democracy and social justice, but here it's a survey that it doesn't depend only on one question, but in a set of questions regarding those dimensions. So we have in this survey two scales, one scale to measure the approval for democracy and one for the approval towards social justice. So this was these were the conceptual dimensions: democratic rules, democratic institutions, liberty rights, equality rights. The scale contains 8 or 9 indicators, but I would like to draw your attention towards the normative claims behind this index, because I think that they are important in this context. So we were asking the people their opinions and their judgment about their unconditional commitment by citizens and political parties to democratic rule of law. Public powers can only be exercised by democratically elected authorities. Individual freedoms are protected by the Constitution and the rule of law. All people deserve equal treatment and no discrimination before the law. So those were the normative claims in this index. And this was the result in 2023, September. It was a special month because it was 1 month before the general election. So if we divide the population in 3 categories, this index goes from 0 to 100, when 100 is total rejection towards democracy and 0 is total approval towards democracy. We could have these 3 groups. The first one, which I call here the group of which have strong commitment towards democratic values, and in that moment it was a group of 24% of the population. Then we have the group with moderate commitment to democratic values that involves the 50% of the population, and this is important, the group with anti-democratic values, which was a group of around 25% of the population. As you can see, this group, 25% of the population, it's quite similar as the LAPOP survey of the same year, 2023. So I will, okay. I will skip this one, and here is the second index, the conceptual dimensions of the social justice index. We use fiscal policy, redistributive policies, and the agreement with flexible labor conditions to build this social justice index. And now I present my final analysis, which is the correlation between these 2 dimensions. As you can see in this, which is a more complex approach to these variables, in 2023, here again, we find a clear and even a strong correlation with the significance in terms of the coefficient of 0.59. It's a national survey of, yes, it was a valid approach to search for this correlation. I will end with this is the same picture, the same figure, the correlation between those variables, but I am pointing out here specifically the voters of the far-right candidate on that year. As you can see, there is a clear political perspective of its voters in both dimensions. 54% of Milei's voters comes from the upper right quadrant, which here will mean that they have anti-democratic values and they have a strong rejection towards social justice. So I would like to read my findings and future results. First, in this context, political commitments are increasingly labeled, yet unstable beliefs still produce significant social and political effects. Beliefs about inequality are as critical as objective trends for democratic legitimacy. When objective trends compound with the legitimation of social justice, support for democratic values declines. The radical right gains most among traditional conservative voters who can no longer conceal market preference with democratic commitments. My fourth finding, I think that it's the better one. Economic grievances fool the radical right, but economic grievances fool the radical right, but through a subjective mechanism, the erosion of belief in social justice. Facing inequality and stagnation without faith in redistributive solutions, individuals seek to stable identities frameworks that radical right parties provide. Identity maps replace social maps. Finally, the ideological spectrum includes not only competing justice frameworks, but also destructive orientations towards democratic institutions themselves. And for further research, it will be necessary to complement this public opinion analysis with studies examining the actual positions in labor markets and income structures of the citizens, which this service doesn't have, to investigate how both lived and anticipated economic anxieties contribute to democratic delegitimation, explore what forms of desperations lead individuals to tolerate or embrace the destruction of democratic institutions, and search forward this apparent counter-trend. Younger generations appear to oscillate between the politics of anger and new forms of democratic experimentalism. Environmental mobilization may signal an alternative pathway for democratic renewal. And finally, examine whether anti-democratic impulses encode genuine economic grievances that could be channeled into democratic alternatives. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I think that the finding about the identity was particularly interesting. And what was also interesting is that Ezequiel did some homework, even though we didn't necessarily expected that. That was really nice to see, because we previously, when we met, we spoke about the relevance of inequality, research on inequality for the environmental movement. And that will be part of the second part of the event today when Mary comes in and we do the panel discussion. So I think that was already a really good start to that and a good basis. So bear with me. Juan Carlos, you might already want to come up. Did we open it already? Yes. Right. So from the start, so that's our second speaker. We have Juan Carlos Palacios, Civico. Oh, I didn't know that. From University of Barcelona, and he will speak about the rise of income inequality in OECD countries. So, it's yours.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thanks to the University of Middlesex and the INCASI project, okay, for making possible this meeting and this sharing of opinions and also findings. So, I don't know, I'm hearing my voice here. Yeah. So, actually, I have to highlight that this paper belongs to a wider project where me with other researchers try to identify the main institutional causes and consequences of inequality. Actually, one of these consequences has to do with de-democratization. So
I can't see the slides. I don't know what that is. Right. So you go.
I can do the presentation.
Yes.
So it is important to frame this paper, okay, within this wider project. The other thing that I want to say before starting presentation is that this paper has not been published yet. So all your comments, all your feedback, okay, is more than welcome. Okay, so I would like to discuss later, okay, with you the results. So what I'm trying to propose in this paper, and later we will see a diagram, okay, that where I try to depict this relationship, is that actually globalization has affected income inequality in two different ways. Yeah, we have to take into account these direct impacts that we can see. I don't know if we are able to see the slides.
Yep.
Yeah. As we can see, globalization has affected income inequality, okay, through this direct impact. For example, we can think of this company moving to Bangladesh, reducing the labor cost and increasing my profits, so in a very direct way. But we have to consider also other type of effects, more indirect, second round effects, that comes from the effect of globalization on what we call the traditional compensatory institutions. That is to say, those institutions that in the past were able to contain or to reduce inequality. For example, the welfare state, the tax system, or trade unions. So if we recognize this second effect, if we recognize that globalization is also affecting this type of institutions, we are recognizing two effects, and this conclusion has implication. On the one side, has a statistical implication, because if we understand that these institutions are interacting with each other, we cannot include these institutional variables, for example, in an OLSD estimation or in a panel data estimation, because they are not exogenous, completely exogenous, because they are affecting each other. And actually, this is the reason why in this paper I'm using the P-VAR methodology, the panel vector autoregressive model. Because in this methodology, the particularity is that we are assuming that my variables can be endogenous. Yeah, we are assuming that in my list of variables, I don't have purely exogenous variables. Yeah, and this is one of the main contributions of the paper. So I have to say also that in this paper, I'm analyzing this effect just for OECD countries, and it allows us to control for economic development. And actually is one of the variables, one of the drivers identified in the literature explaining income inequality. For example, think of the Kuznets curve. And the other thing that I have to mention is that the period of study has been from 1989 to 2018. So one of the things that we have to bear in mind, one of the limitations, is that our methodology, okay, cannot work, is not going to work properly with many variables. So we have to try to reduce the number of variables. And this is the reason why in this paper, the variables that I'm going to use are 3 variables: inequality, globalization, and compensatory institutions. In the first case, I'm going to choose 3 different indicators for measuring inequality. The Gini coefficient, because actually it's the most used indicator for measuring inequality, while it is challenging many criticism as well, because there are many authors that highlight that the Gini coefficient is not able to capture what is happening in the tails. These average results are hiding somehow this behavior. And this is the reason why I include in the analysis also 2 more indicators: the PALMA index, that is calculated as the ratio between the income accumulated by the top richest decile and the income accumulated by the 40% poorest part of the population. And in my case, I also include this 90-10 ratio that is calculated as the ratio between the income accumulated by the richest decile and the poorest decile. In the case of globalization, I'm going to use the cost globalization index that is quite common in the literature, in the empirical literature that tries to measure globalization. And in my case, because of the limitations that I have mentioned before, I'm going to choose 2 compensatory institutions, only 2, that are the redistributive capacity of states on the one hand and the union density on the other hand. The reason why I'm choosing these institutional variables has to do with the literature. And let me summarize now in a very brief way, what can we find in the literature that deals with the drivers of inequality? The first thing that we see in the slide is that the main driver highlighted by the literature is technological progress. Here we are assuming that technology is not neutral. Technology is generating winners and losers, and is favoring those high-skilled workers and is substituting these middle-skilled workers. So technology is provoking a kind of polarization, wage polarization and labor polarization that will be explaining, income inequality. It is important to highlight that this is the main driver identified by the literature, and it is also it's an apolitical factor. Because if we assume that the main reason for explaining inequality is technology, it's going to be very difficult to fight against inequality. Because technology provides many positive results. All the positive results, our welfare, efficiency, economic growth. We could discuss if economic growth is good or not, but it's very difficult to find. So when we are identifying technology as the main driver, actually, what we are also stating is that inequality is something that we have to accept because it's like a collateral damage, that is included in the equation. Another strand of literature identifies globalization as one of the drivers, but it's true that just considering those direct effects that I have depicted before. And the reason why I have chosen the 2 compensatory institutions that I have shown before has to do with this slide. Actually, the majority of the literature that consider institutional variables are considering labor institutions, for example, trade unions, or the labor legislation as one of the potential drivers of inequality. For example, of the typical neoliberal reform that tries to make dismissals cheaper and easier, or tries to favor temporary and partial hiring. So this is one of the one strand of the literature that tries to explain inequality through these institutional factors. And the second strand of the literature, explaining inequality through institutional factors, try to do so by including or by capturing the effect of globalization on the redistributive capacity of a state. That is to say, by considering the effect on the tax reduction, on the spending cuts in what has been called the race to the bottom literature. That is to say, we are competing for attracting foreign capital, so we have to reduce taxes. But at the same time, as we have reduced taxes, we have to reduce also the public expenditure because we cannot fund our welfare state. But as you can see here also, we have versus compensation thesis. That is to say, not all works agree that globalization has reduced the welfare state, has reduced the redistributive capacity of states. For example, the most famous work and author here in this part of the literature is Roderick, 1998, that claims that actually the redistributive capacity of the states has increased as a result or as a consequence of the losers' claims to be compensated. The losers of globalization asking their states to be compensated because of their income losses. So this is a summary of the literature, and is the reason why I have chosen these variables. So the first step in the empirical analysis is to verify that actually inequality has increased over our period of study. And this is what we see in this table, regardless of the indicator we are choosing for measuring inequality. Inequality increased by 14%, by 10%, or by 25%, okay, in our sample. The second step before regressing the model is to verify actually that my variables are endogenous, because otherwise I should use other methodologies, for example, panel data methodology. And actually it's what we see in this table. We are rejecting the null hypothesis of exogeneity. That is to say, what we are seeing is that globalization for our sample, for our period of study, is actually explaining the union density behavior. It's actually explaining the redistributive capacity of the states. So we cannot consider these variables as exogenous because they are also affected by globalization. So it was a good idea in this case to choose this p-var methodology. So let me go, I don't know if I have.
5 to 7 minutes.
Okay, it's gonna be enough. So let me go to the final results. But first, I'm gonna explain a little bit how to interpret these graphs in case you are not familiar. Yeah. In this impulse response function, as you see, we have two kinds of lines. Yeah. We have this black solid line, which is showing the value and the sign of our effect. In this case, for example, we are finding that globalization has a positive, ranging from 0.05 to 0.10, positive effect on inequality. That is to say, the more globalized a country is, the more unequal. Yeah? Both variables evolve in the same way because the effect, the impact is positive. But this is just the sign. The second step is to analyze the coincident bands to verify if this effect is significant, statistically significant or not. To verify this significance, what we have to see if my bands are at the same side of the zero division line. That is to say, in this first case, in this first graph, for the first period, this positive effect is significant because both coincident bands are above the zero line. Yeah, do you understand? Any doubts?
What are the axes?
Yeah, the axis is the zero division line. So as you can see only in this part, both red lines, discontinuous and red line, are above. From here, you have one bar above the zero line and the other bar under the division line.
What are the axes?
The axis is here.
What are the labels? What does the y-axis mean?
Here we are just capturing the change of one variable, the reaction of one variable when the other variable changes. Here we have the periods. So this is the first year, second year, third year.
Okay.
And this is measuring the change. Yeah. It's not as a percentage, okay, it's measured as a standard deviation change. So if we understand, okay, how do we interpret these results? What we see in this slide is that globalization has affected, okay, income inequality regardless of the indicator that we measure, that we use for measuring inequality, because actually, as we can see in this first slide, in these first models, we find a positive effect and a significant effect for some periods. Yeah. Also, when we measure inequality through the PALMA index, positive effect and also significant effect for some periods, in this case, for example, in the second part of the period of the study. And in the third case, also positive effect and also significant for some period. So the results are quite robust when it comes to understand the direct effect of globalization on income inequality. Let's go on and let's move to the second effect, to the indirect effect. And to understand this indirect effect, the first thing that we have to do is to understand how these compensatory institutions affect income inequality. Let's start by the effect of the redistribution capacity of states. What we see is that we find that negative, okay, in this case, the effect is negative and is significant for some periods. In this model, the same is going to happen, okay, when we measure inequality through the PALMA index, negative and also significant for some periods. And the same is going to happen with the third indicator. So again, the results are quite robust when it comes to the effect of the redistribution capacity of states for explaining income inequality. In this case, the effect is negative. That is quite understandable, because it means that the higher the redistributive capacity of the states, the lower the level of inequality. In this case, the relationship is negative. Let's analyze now the effect of union density shocks. Yeah, how it's going to affect the change in union density to our level of inequality. And here we have diverse results. And here our results and our conclusions are going to depend on the indicator we use for measuring inequality. In this first case, actually, we find a counterintuitive result, because actually, as you can see, we have a positive effect that is significant from here, okay, to here. What would mean that actually the higher the union density, the higher the Gini coefficient. This is a little bit a strange result, because actually it's quite counterintuitive. But actually, when we change the way of measuring inequality, we find here that in this case, in this second case, the effect is not significant, because the bars, the coincidence bar, the confidence bar, are in different sides. And in the third case, the effect of union density becomes negative and significant. That is to say, when we measure inequality through the ratio between the income accumulated by the richest decile and the income accumulated by the poorest decile, unions are much more important. Unions reduce inequality. So if we reduce unions, yeah, if we reduce union density, we are going to increase inequality when we measure it through this indicator, because as you can see now, the sign is negative. And finally, to complete these indirect effects, the last thing that we have to see is how globalization has affected these compensatory institutions. In the three first graphs, or in the graphs that we find on the left side, what we see again is a quite robust result. Positive results and significant results, okay, for the three graphs, regardless of the indicator that we use for measuring inequality. In this case, the results show that the higher the globalization, the higher the redistribution capacity of states. That is to say, in this case, the empirical results for this sample, or this period, support the Rodrigues conclusion, supports the compensation thesis. Maybe because the losers are making pressure, or another thing that is not considered by Roderick, because actually most OECD countries, tax systems in most OECD countries are progressive. So we have to understand also that if during the period of study the income has increased, it makes sense that the percentage, the tax rate, can increase also, because our tax system is progressive. So if now we are richer than 20 years ago, it makes sense that we pay a higher percentage, not just higher income, also higher percentage of our income. And the last result, okay, is gonna support this idea of union density, very important for the poorest part of the society, because what we see in this right side of the slide is that globalization has affected negatively trade unions and in a significant way. So the more globalized the country, the lower their union density. So the conclusions of the paper are the ones that I have been explaining, okay, through these 20 minutes. That is to say, globalization has contributed to increase inequality in OECD countries in different ways, in this direct, with these direct effects and also these indirect effects, that public institutions are also effective instruments to reduce inequality, as we have seen with the redistributive capacity of states. That actually this compensation thesis is supported by the results. So we cannot conclude that the redistributive capacity of the state today is lower than 20, 25 years ago. But it's interesting to say something. If we take into account that the redistributive capacity of the state has not been reduced, but the net inequality increased regardless of the indicator, it means that the state has not been able to compensate the high increase in the market inequality. Yeah? So the problem that we find with inequality is not that our states today do much less than 20 years ago. The problem is that market inequality has increased a lot. So this capacity of states to reduce inequality has not been enough to reduce net inequality. And some important result has to do with the role of union, especially important for the poorest part of the population. When we measure, when we try to capture what is happening in the extreme deciles, we find that trade unions are much more relevant to explain their income and to explain also income inequality in this part of the population. Yeah, so thank you very much for hearing and for your attention.
Brilliant. Can I ask you to come forward? And I hope you don't have the light straight in your face, but we have a short Q&A for you, okay? And I'm sure they are here, so the people online can see better. Thank you. Oh, yeah, stop. So I'm sure that people in the room actually have quite a few questions, but let me just read out the comment from the online chat. Oh, you can actually see it there. So Antonio Martin said that especially since you stressed the importance of unions, I thought maybe we follow up with this one here, where Antonio Martin says that